I want to bring into our conversation now Zach Roth, national political reporter for MSNBC.com, Judith Browne Dianis, who's the co-director of the National Advancement Project, and Sirius XM's Michael Smerconish, who's also an MSNBC contributor. It's great to have all of you here. Judith, I want to start with you because we have the Advancement Project filing a lawsuit on behalf of the NAACP, and shortly after the signing of this law, then we have the North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory putting up this video on YouTube, not giving interviews, but putting up just a straightforward clip on YouTube to respond to what the law means. Take a look.
Let me be direct. Many of those from the extreme left who have been criticizing photo ID are using scare tactics. They're more interested in divisive politics than ensuring that no one's vote is disenfranchised by a fraudulent ballot. Protecting the integrity of every vote cast is among the most important duties I have as governor.
All right, so Judith, what do you make of the fact that it was signed without any fanfare? There were no cameras there. Also in the statement, the governor goes on to equate voting rights to getting on an airplane or to cashing a check. Do you think that these comparisons are fair, and is it the real reason why he made this YouTube clip so he doesn't have to answer the tough questions?
Well, Thomas, he was reading out of the Republican playbook on this one. We've heard those talking points before. We heard them in 2011 and 2012 when states moved to disenfranchise voters through voter ID, which we know is not necessary, and actually we don't have cases of voter fraud that would be fixed by this. But what's also important is that this North Carolina law is not just voter ID. It is an omnibus bill that undermines democracy and equality in this country. It goes after most of the provisions of North Carolina's election law, which will make it harder to vote. So not only is it ID, but also cutting same-day registration, cutting early voting. 70% of African-American voters in 2012 who voted by early voting. So we know that this law is about making it harder to vote, that for those who turned out in record numbers in 2008 and 2012, namely African-Americans, Latinos, and young voters. So it's much bigger than ID. And by the way, Thomas, you actually don't need a photo ID, state-issued photo ID to get on a plane. But that's another point.
All right, well, I want to play this for everybody because Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, has not dipped her toes in the political waters, and yesterday she did in a speech in San Francisco while speaking at the annual American Bar Association conference. And one of the topics she addressed specifically was voting rights in North Carolina. Take a look.
Legislators in North Carolina have pushed through a bill that reads like the greatest hits of voter suppression. Restricted early voting, no more same-day registration, or extending voting hours to accommodate long lines, stricter photo ID requirements that disqualify those issued by colleges. So we've seen a sweeping effort across our country to obstruct new obstacles to voting, often under cover of addressing a phantom epidemic of election fraud. Not every obstacle is related to race, but anyone who says that racial discrimination is no longer a problem in American elections must not be paying attention.
Zach, let me ask you, is this the most on the record that we've seen Hillary Clinton in terms of tipping her hat to wanting to run for the election in 2016 to be president?
It's certainly one of the key signs that she's made so far that suggests she may run. And remember, this was the first in a series of policy speeches that she plans to give, so we can expect some more. But just to jump back to the North Carolina issue, if I may, one of the things that I think is attracting a lot of outrage is the photo ID provision itself is stricter even than some of the other photo ID laws that other states have passed, where it requires not only that you have a current valid state ID, but that ID exactly match your name on your voter registration card, which is tripping up a lot of voters, including, I think, the plaintiff in the lawsuit that Judith's group has filed. So that's... Go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask Michael, what do you make of this? We're looking at images that we remember from Florida, the long voter lines that we had there in the last election. This is just going to be a precursor to what we might get coming up in North Carolina. But what do you make of the criticism against these laws, and also about the fact that Hillary Clinton has stepped out there publicly now and gotten political?
Well, First, with regard to the governor, I think he's made a gross miscalculation. Notice, Thomas, how he characterized the opposition to what he's done as coming from the extreme left. I'm not sure what the extreme left is, but I know I'm not a part of it. I'm just offended by this because it represents, I think, a changing, a warping of the rules. And I've long believed that in the 2012 campaign, where it was Romney against Obama, that this came back to haunt the GOP because this became associated with the GOP brand, and that people who are not partisans and are not at the extremes but are somewhere in the middle looked at this and said, you know what, it smells bad, it's not right, it's not the way. Beat them fair and square at the election box, not by manipulating the rules.
Well, it was almost a dare. You know, I dare you to try to take away my voting rights. Okay, I'm gonna have to meet these burdens, which are ridiculous. But it was almost a dare, so people did show up. And Judith, we saw record numbers of people turning out, and that was the whole reason why the Supreme Court felt and ruled the way that it did, that the Voting Rights Act was unnecessary for the oversight that Pete was telling us about. And then here we are. The minute, hardly the ink is dry on that ruling. And here we see states reflexively pulling these muscular and discriminatory Voting Rights Act tactics, that is.
Right, Thomas, it's important to know that the North Carolina legislature was still in session when the Shelby County case was decided by the Supreme Court, and that this proposed law had been pending. And after that decision, they moved pretty swiftly to pass it and then for the governor to sign it. What's also important to know is that we are bringing this lawsuit, Advancement Project and the North Carolina NAACP, under the Voting Rights Act. We are asking the court actually to rule that they have also violated the Constitution, and we're trying to get them under the provision of the Voting Rights Act that would require approval of any changes that they make, similar to what the Justice Department did in Texas. We know that North Carolina has a history of this. Our main plaintiff is a woman who registered to vote in the 1940s. She's 92 years old. She had to pass a literacy test where she had to recite the Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution. And here it is, all of these years later, 70 years later, where we are going backwards, where she may not be able to vote because the state has passed a law that will not make elections free, fair, and accessible.
And Zach, how did they get around this being considered a poll tax?
Well, one of the ways they got around it is that the federal government, because of the Supreme Court's ruling in June, doesn't have the ability now to force them to pre-clear the law. As Judith was saying, the Justice Department can still sue under what's called Section 2 of the law, which bars racial discrimination in voting, and maybe a court will decide that this is too big of a burden on racial minorities, but certainly a major tool that the Justice Department used to have in its toolkit to challenge these kind of laws no longer exists, and that's been a big factor.
Michael, do you think that Congress will take up a new and improved Voting Rights Act?
No.
Yeah.
No, and frustratingly, the answer is no. Superficially, you look at this and you say, well, of course they will, because in the last reauthorization, it was nearly unanimous. In fact, I think in the Senate, it was a 98-0 vote, so it was unanimous. It's one of those things where, in the light of day, when you hold them accountable, they have to stand up. Are you for the Voting Rights Act? Of course, I'm for the Voting Rights Act. But behind, backstage, where sausage is made, where now the heavy lifting has to get done, the GOP-controlled House is running for cover. Yeah. There's nothing they'll do about it. What they ought to do is have a federal standard for federal elections, congressional, Senate, and president, have a uniform ballot, no more shenanigans, uniform rules of operation. That would be a big step forward. But will that happen in the GOP House? It won't.
Well, they had the responsibility of doing this, and they failed us. They failed the American people by not taking it seriously and taking it up and allowing it to get to the Supreme Court.
They're underestimating the blowback. I'm telling you, this is not just a partisan issue. People will be so offended by the indecency of it, I maintain, when the facts get out of what's being attempted.
All right. Judith Browne Dianis, Michael Smerconish, Zach Roth, thanks for being here. It's really good to have all of your insights on this topic, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon.